Enterprise Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
Yay, here we are, and we have a great episode today. I'm so excited for everyone to hear it.
Yeah, it's really fun, and I, once again, learned some stuff, like how to use the word bitch.
Yeah, which is always good to know.
Yeah, it was a great time. It was
a
really great time.
And, there's some light in the dark world, this episode, yes. I believe.
Yes. So speaking of dark world, but not not the darkest possible part, right. I think we could talk about. I don't know if you heard. Did you hear that they were going to change the Australian Constitution, adding more Indigenous voices into the?
No, I've not heard anything about this.
Okay, so the referendum would have this is all it would have done.
Okay.
The referendum would have created an advocacy committee to offer advice to Parliament on policies that affect Indigenous people.
Okay, so this would have included Indigenous people on this advocacy committee.
I assume so.
Hoping so.
I assume it would be completely made up of Indigenous people, but
yes, you'd hope so. But yeah, okay, so this is what it's going to do. Okay,
that's what it's going to do.
Simple and clear, and good,
and and not even that powerful.
No.
It's such a minor change to the Constitution. I almost can't even believe it's a change to the Constitution. You're just creating an advocacy group. Or, that's it.
It's
tiny.
One of those things where you're like, how is that not already a thing?
Well, I can see why it's not a thing, but it just seems like such a small ask that I can't believe that the results are at least 60% against.
People are 60% against this.
Yeah, the vote has come in, and as of, I don't know, last time I checked, it was 60% against. 60% no.
I think there are moments like these where I think I must be more naive than I think I am. Because I'm like, this is such a simple, easy yes.
Yeah. How does it impact your life if you're not Indigenous? Barely at all. So why not just say yes?
Do people think it's going to affect their lives, though, in a negative way? I mean, people in power think that they're going to have some of their power taken away from them.
I guess, but, honestly, not really. I mean, the Parliament doesn't have to listen.
It's true. Yeah, no, so this, again, the advocacy group would suggest things. And of course, I would hope that these suggestions would be taken very seriously and that some of them would be implemented. But that's not even the part that's being added to the Constitution, that, suggestions that have been made are being added. It's just the creation of this group.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't.
And then they would have some formalized power, but so minimal, right? It's so minimal.
Right.
Well, yeah, the percentage of population in Australia that's Indigenous is 3%. So they're 3%. A tiny minority.
Right.
In Canada, it's 5%.
Do you know what it is here? Isn't it 2% here? Or 1%? I think I just saw this. Dang it.
I think let's look it up.
Yeah, I just saw it. So U.S. News and World Report says that it's 2.6% of the total population.
2.6?
Of the U.S.
Yeah, so that's even smaller than Australia.
Right.
Can you imagine a referendum like this in the U.S. and how it would go?
I mean, right now it probably wouldn't go so well.
It would not.
I mean...
It would not. It would probably be maybe similar. And in Canada, too, I don't think, even though the population is slightly bigger, I don't think that would necessarily pass.
I mean, there's going to be that whole... Well, then we need a advocacy group for the white people to talk about our needs, because blah, 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 something. I don't know. I just trying to put myself in people's shoes that say such ridiculous things. It's hard. It's hard to imagine what is the problem that they're having with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a lack of, a perceived loss of power. And again, I don't even think it's really that a loss of power. I think it's only perceived loss of power.
It is perceived loss of power.
Because the advocacy group is just advocating for things. It wouldn't actually have any formal say. Parliament would still vote the way it normally votes. And you know, if your population is only 3%, like, you're not going to have a huge say in that vote, right?
Yeah.
So,
you know, it does remind me of something positive, though. I just finally started Reservation Dogs, which is fantastic.
Oh, yeah, it is. I haven't finished it because whatever channel it is, I don't have.
Yeah.
I got to have like the first 4 or 5 episodes or whatever it was.
Yeah. Of the first season?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, because there's 3 seasons now, but I've watched 2 episodes now, and I'm just like so impressed. And it just reminds me of this because they have on the second episode this conversation between an older white couple, and they pass by some graffiti that says "land back," and they were just discussing what does that mean. And the man is saying they don't mean like all the land back, right? And the woman was just like, just shut the fuck up. This is you're part of the problem. And notice the res English too in the show. It's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's apparently some of it, you know, like we were talking about in our res English episode, we talk about how some of these things are like all over the continent, but some of them are like some of what's happening is unique to that region. I don't know if it's just Oklahoma or if it's like the surrounding area too, but like apparently like Sonics, instead of saying Sonic, is a more Oklahoman res English thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I read anyway. Yeah, because that wouldn't be a thing here at all because we don't have Sonic. So
okay. In Canada, it's like, what do you mean?
Well, at least
here?
in this part of Canada.
Yeah.
At least in this part of Canada. I can't speak for all of Canada, but I don't think it's in Canada.
Yeah. Oh, hey, our episode today is like concentrated in Oklahoma.
That's true.
Hey, I didn't mean to do that, but there's that connection because I didn't know what you were going to tell me.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the only reason why I even saw this is because an Australian linguist said something about how sad he was that this had happened. And I was like, oh no. Because I did know that the vote was happening. I just hadn't seen the results.
Right. And didn't know they'd be so dire. I mean, this is not even like a close vote.
I'm not surprised, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, these are, like, having these kinds of things up for Democratic vote always make me worried because I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, people will vote for super bloodthirsty things. Like, I don't know if it's still the case, but 20 years ago, if you had a referendum in Canada for death penalty, it would pass.
Yeah. In Canada.
So,
Huh. But not today.
Well, I don't know. I'm just saying. I know those were the numbers back then. I don't know what the numbers are right now.
Yeah.
And I just, no, it's immoral. So we shouldn't put immoral things up to vote.
I know.
Which is, we couldn't. The courts would shoot it down no matter what. Like, the courts have said, no, you can't have death penalty, so there's no death penalty.
That's nice. That's not the case down here. Down under.
No.
Not down under. We're talking about Australia.
Down under from Canada, yes.
Yes. It's down under.
But almost everywhere is down under from us.
It's true. Yeah. Is it cold there yet? Not
no.
Quite.
Oh my God. It is so warm. Today I don't think it's as warm, but it has been like Vancouver summer temperatures. Wow. And I am like, well, we're boned.
Oh, that sucks. Yeah. I know. We're having like unseasonably high as well, but anything under 100, I'm just like, yay, it's fall, which is depressing.
Mm-hmm. I kind of remember.
It is depressing. Although it gets into like the 50s at night, so that's nice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it gets definitely very cool in the overnight here. It's more like the daytime temperatures are still way too high. But yeah, at least it does get what I would even call cold.
Right. Night. Yeah, no, I know. Other people are like, wow, down to the 50s. Oh, that's so low. No, well, yeah.
Just try living in southern Arizona or central Arizona and come back and explain to us.
Yeah, no, exactly. Anytime someone makes fun of me for not, for being cold intolerant, I'm like, you should see my heat tolerance or what we have to go through here.
Yeah, I don't have tolerance for either.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is why I now live in Vancouver, which basically doesn't really have either.
Yes.
Anyway. Oh, I know what I need to do.
Patreon?
Yes, Patreon.
Yes.
So you can get free access. I think it's for a week. And we have a bunch of people who are doing that right now. So thank you for trying that out.
Thank you.
But also, I would like to thank our newest patron, Renee Canup. I think that's how you say it. I apologize if I said it wrong.
Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, so again, if you want to join us, we're at patreon.com/vocalfriespod.
And we have so many bonus episodes at this point.
That 60-something?
Yeah, that you can go back into and listen to. Mm-hmm. And they, like, are all over the place of topics, so that's fun.
Yes. It's where we, play around a little bit more,
We rant and rave. Not that we don't do that here. Get salty.
We get saltier, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we keep it profesh over here. That's something that people definitely say about this podcast. Although, oh my God, I've listened to some podcasts lately, and I'm like, the sound quality, I'm surprised that these podcasts that have, like, however many episodes and still the sound quality is pretty poor. So I think our indie podcast has sounds really great. I just like to say that.
Yeah, most of them do. There are a couple episodes that were subpar, but yeah, I think mostly we do a good job making sure that our audio sounds okay, and our editor does a great job.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to our editor. And so please, if you can, please support this indie podcast, and it helps us pay for the transcriptions, which are so important to us to provide.
And the editor.
And our editor. Mm-hmm. Which makes it so much easier for Carrie, who was editing for so long.
Yes, and it's not my favorite thing to do.
Yeah. Give it to someone who actually wants to be paid.
Who enjoys doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Who has to listen to us all the time, but that's okay.
All the time. Once a month.
Yeah. Anyway.
All right. Yeah, so thank you so much, and enjoy this episode.
Yeah, enjoy.
All right, so we're very excited to have Dr. Bryce McCleary, who is a lecturer in linguistics at Rice University. Their research focuses on language and identity, particularly concerning gender and sexuality. Their research often centers around the voices of LGBTQ+ communities, their awareness of language, and the important role language plays in navigating increasingly difficult cultural terrain in the United States. And they're also the author of the paper, We All Country, Region, Place, and Community Language Among Oklahoma City Drag Performers. So welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Of course. Thank you very much for having me. I'm a fan of the show. I'm very, very happy and excited to be here, to be invited. It's a great pleasure and an honor.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for saying so. Well, we feel the same way about you.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw this paper and I thought, yes, we want to have someone talking about drag performers. Like, we've never talked about that. That's amazing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of those things that has always sort of been, people care about drag or like drag or maybe dislike drag, and it's sort of always been around. But in the last couple of years, there's just such a spotlight on it, for better or worse. Well, mostly for worse, but actually also it's drawing a lot of attention and support to drag. So I feel like it's a really timely subject to be thinking about, especially in a venue like Vocal Fries. I mean, it's kind of the perfect place to be talking about drag research and sociolinguistics, especially in a time when it's just center stage right now in American politics, I think.
100%.
It is. And was it the Oscars when the person that won for Best Director or Best Movie, they said, like, he was thanking his parents for letting him dress up and how, like, dressing up in women's clothes hurts no one. So that, too, like, it's just kind of everywhere.
Yeah. And understandably so, because, just to, I guess, get it out of the way now, because there's so much more cool stuff to talk about than the sort of silly political games that are being played by targeting drag. It's actually all a distraction, I think.
Yeah,
of course
absolutely.
It is. Of course. Yeah. It's fascism. That's what they do. They distract.
Exactly. Like, climate crisis and the gun issue and voting rights, those are all the things that they're trying to distract people from. And painting one subpopulation of the broader LGBTQ plus umbrella as dangerous to children. This is actually a really old tactic. So
yes,
it's
100%.
not even interesting to look at anymore.
Absolutely.
No, but drag is.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
It absolutely is.
So why did you want to write this article?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question. Okay, so the simple answer is that this was my PhD dissertation and I needed to make that into something that could be published.
I love the honesty.
Yes.
No, but this particular paper, this particular version of stuff that was done for the dissertation actually came out of the sort of COVID era digital scholarship when no one could go to meetings. We couldn't go hang out with other linguists. All the conferences were either postponed or digital. And so the LSA, the Linguistic Society of America, put on a sort of series of different webinars they would do that I think they were inspired by the Associação Brasileira de Linguística, the ABRALIN, and they did that Ao Vivo series, which was awesome. So I actually got asked to be in two different panels, one for LSA and one for ABRALIN. And in both of them, I was sort of just doing an overview of what I call queer folk linguistics, which is a sort of bridging of folk linguistics and sociocultural linguistics. And one of the things that seemed to get a lot of interest was how I essentially said that when you actually start asking, especially queer people, about place or region, and perhaps especially in places like the American South, we start to see that even though sociolinguistics has this history of treating region and place as a sort of static variable, that actually it could be quite intersectional and quite complex for people. And so this led to some discussions, and my co-editor for the special issue actually said, well, why don't we just put out feelers and say people who are interested in this or doing work on this, if they'd like, we could see if American Speech would be interested. They were. And so I just took a lot of the talk that I had from drag performers in Oklahoma City and what they had to say about the place in which they do drag. And that's sort of what the article was all about, kind of trying to highlight that a place like Oklahoma City, and particularly this sort of safe haven, what they call the gayborhood or the strip, is itself complicated, but also in a really intersectional way because it's within probably at least one of the two only metropolitan areas within the state, in a state that's notably conservative and not always safe or celebratory of LGBTQ plus peoples. And so that sort of complicates the relationship between place and what we can say about its relationship to language variation and language change. That was a really long way of answering that. I'm sorry.
That was a beautiful way of answering that. Yeah. I wonder, do you have a personal connection to Oklahoma City?
Yeah, I'm from there. I grew up there. I was probably 21, 22 when I went to my first drag show there. And I mean, this is both personal, and I think I can make the claim that drag has and still does play a significant role in Oklahoma City's gay neighborhood. It just so happens to also be down the street from Oklahoma City University, which has a really big theater, music, and nursing program that I believe still offers a scholarship for male nurses based on gender, to bring in nurses who identify as male, which is really fun. But it's down the street, and so it gets lots of young people to the area, as well as being the place where the Gay Pride Parade always has its terminus and ends with the big party there. And that's been going on a long time before I was even there. But so my growing up and experiencing that, it sort of was just always in the back of my mind. By the time I made it to grad school, someone said, why don't you study the drag community? Why don't you look at them? And I thought, why don't I do that? I should totally do that. So
yeah. Yeah, you brought up queer folk linguistics. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so I think okay, I'm going to back up here. I get too excited. So I think one of my favorite ways to remind people of why folk linguistics matters is that I think that it's probably always been the case that sociolinguists in particular have said that what people think or care or believe about language matters. There's a particular, I think one of the first sociolinguistics conferences that happened in UCLA in the 1960s, there's a discussion that's going on, and one of them, or one participant in that is, of course, William Labov, who is sort of cited often in sociolinguistics, who says, well, if you go around and you listen to people talking about language and you hear them say things about like nasality, for example, they'll hear someone who's really nasalized, but they could also hear someone who's denasalized a lot, and they'll call both of them nasal. And so his whole argument was, so how can we trust the non-linguists? They don't really know what they're talking about. And by the 1990s, Dennis Preston starts writing about, well, wait a minute, what if actually they just don't have a technical term for inappropriate levels of nasality? And so by talking about something being nasal, that's just the vocabulary they've got. And they're actually accurately identifying too much or too little based on their own experience of nasality. So this leads into Preston's work on folk linguistics, namely asking non-linguists what they think about language, how they react to certain varieties of language, what they believe about it. Queer folk linguistics then sort of takes that same methodology, and I attempted applying that to queer populations in Oklahoma. And one of the things that sort of seemed important to me was that sometimes you get explicit stuff like, oh, that guy over there, he sounds real dumb. He says things like ain't, and I ain't going nowhere, and that's just real uneducated. But sometimes you get things that are more presuppositional or implicit, like things that are not so explicitly that language is X or Y. And so I started to think that, first of all, I'm always reminded when I talk about this of a quote from Lal Zemin, who is certainly one of the most cited sociolinguists working in language, gender, and sexuality. He was giving a talk at a special sort of event or panel at one of the Linguistic Society of America's meetings, and he said that trans people are natural linguists. And it was just such a poignant thing to say, because people who are non-cisgender, who live lives that require a sort of sensitivity to language, to navigate, or otherwise to think about how people are referring to them and what kinds of work it takes to either put up with that or correct people or decide if it's worth doing that. And of course, you can make parallels to other people that are either not trans or not, or who live other kinds of lives too. Different kinds of people have different linguistic experiences. But I'm always brought back to that and thinking about how when non-linguists are talking about language, they're kind of always doing identity work. I mean, they're kind of always saying, like, I think this way, and that says something about me and how I see language and I use language. So that's a really long way of saying what I tried to do was sort of marry the Prestonian tradition of folk linguistics, or a broader interest in language regard, with a sort of sociocultural linguistic analysis. Like, how is this always working towards the practice of identity? You know, and I think that the sort of tools or traditions we have in sociocultural linguistics when dealing with queer populations of people, you know, when we know to just not take certain things for granted, or to assume that queer people are somehow doing extra identity work when that's certainly, you know, not the case. Keeping those sorts of the things that we've gleaned from both those sort of channels of research and trying to put them together. That's essentially what queer folk linguistics is trying to do, if that makes any sense.
I love it so much because it's kind of like, it relates to how I describe myself. Like if I'm giving a talk or something and doing positionality, I'll say that I'm a linguist, and then I'll say I have a PhD in linguistics, but I'm also a linguist at heart. And I think it's getting to that folk linguistic kind of thing, because I became a linguist because of all these ideas of my dad speaks Spanish, why don't I speak Spanish? And so like me trying to figure out, and the ideas that I had about language and all of that were kind of like what make me a linguist at heart. And I like the idea that it, like, you know, everyone is a linguist because we all have language and we all have ideas about it.
Absolutely. Well, they're kind of inseparable. I mean, we acquire language, you know, a dialect of, you know, whatever dialect we grow up around, or dialects we grow up around. But people talk about language and they talk about using things in certain ways. And it's kind of impossible to imagine acquiring a language without also acquiring some of the sort of social or cultural connections we make with certain ways of speaking and certain ways of being.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so why is it important to research the language of drag performers?
Yeah, also a great question, and one that I feel like I have to start by saying, of course, this has been exampled by Rusty Barrett's work before I ever sort of started doing this. Barrett looked at drag performers in Texas. And in fact, what I tell my students today, which is really great because a lot of them who take, like this fall, for example, at Rice, I'll be teaching our language, gender, and sexuality course. And it's one of those classes that gets lots of people who not just Ling majors. And there's usually a lot of RuPaul's Drag Race fans who are in there. And I tell them that the first real piece of sociolinguistic research to look at drag queens included Coco Montrese, who is now a sort of icon of RuPaul's Drag Race. But in this study, Barrett talked about how drag performers are able to do what he called a sort of stylistic polyphony, or polyphonous voices. That is, that they would use different dialects, different styles, different ways of speaking in the same performance. And a lot of people talk about this or bring it up when they cite Barrett, but what they often forget about is that what clearly is an intentional aspect of this is the juxtaposition of two very different sounding styles, so that you can get a drag queen saying like, "Hi y'all, welcome to the show, but don't act up, Buster." The sort of like very different sounding voices put next to each other. And I think that there's the fact that this is clearly employed for a kind of humor or a kind of, entertainment should probably tell us, especially as sociolinguists, that means that things are going to change in a way that reflects what's going on in society or what's relevant in society. So I think that's one reason why to continue looking at drag performers and how they talk. But I think another added element of that is that drag performers and the way that they perform sort of highlights the ways that we're all kind of always doing drag, no matter when we're feeling our most comfortable to when we're being our most professional or silly. We're always practicing some aspect of our identity. And I think that drag allows a really nice example of how we can think about that or model that in a way, because it does feel more deliberate when it's done on a stage with sometimes ridiculous or elaborate presentations.
Yeah. And what can we get when we look at one specific place like Oklahoma City?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So for example, Oklahoma, I think just linguistically is fascinating. It's one of the newer states because for the longest time, it was just an area where indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from largely the eastern tract of unseized or sovereign territory of southeastern tribes, moved to Oklahoma, and was also, people don't know this, but a place where many formerly enslaved peoples also moved prior to the so-called land runs. So it was actually an already diverse and complicated place prior to these land runs in which unceded territories. So for example, we're talking about like Cherokee tribes being marched from the eastern coast, but this is also the unceded territory of like Wichita and Osage nations who were already there in this particular place. And then more land gets opened up. And then, of course, we get a rush of largely white settlers, but they came from the Midlands, from the upper South, from Texas and the lower South. So by the time Oklahoma is a state, it's dialectologically quite diverse and culturally diverse. And I think a lot of that history is actually still present if you look around the state. And when we look at a place like Oklahoma City's 39th Street, you've got a rich cultural makeup that I think is at times reflective of Oklahoma's diverse makeup, but also in a way that's sort of, even more celebratory of this sort of eclectic mix of people, because there's lots of, there's lots of Spanish language, there's lots of African-American language varieties, there's lots of class-based distinctions with how people talk within this particular community. And there's a lot of mixed feelings about whether or not Oklahoma is a good place to live and do drag.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. And so I think that on the purely social science side of things, it's just fascinating. There's a lot of different attitudes and ideas about this place. But I don't want to suggest that means that everyone who does drag here hates living here. That's actually not the case. There's a lot of people for whom this has been their home for generations, and for whom this is a place where enacting change means more than packing up and leaving.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so you and I are both born and raised in the South, but I'm from the Southwest, and I think about how Arizona is a place where people assume it's not a good place to live. And how I think it might be kind of similar to how people view Oklahoma City. I had family in Oklahoma, so I've been to Oklahoma City. And I had ideas about Oklahoma when I was little, too, because my dad's Mexican, my mom's not. And so I had these ideas that it was a racist place. But then I'm thinking, people think Arizona is this racist, like this terribly racist place, as if our society isn't racist. It's a bigger picture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that a lot of this sort of the understanding that we get of this, and don't get me wrong, Oklahoma, by some metrics, is absolutely a racist place.
Yeah, right.
It absolutely is. Growing up, my stepdad is part African-American and part Samoan. And so I have younger siblings who are also of mixed race. And so growing up, as a kid, I was kind of sheltered from a lot, because I was just like in this like multiracial family where like this is just what life looked like. And we were also kind of country. Like we did not live in the city proper. We lived in the outskirts. And so I knew that we were all country. And I know that that's related to where we're going with the title of this article. But I knew that we were all country. But I didn't realize that for a lot of people, I think that there's this association with being rural and being country means being conservative white. But actually, Oklahoma does not support that. You can find plenty of evidence to the alternative, that there are lots of people of non-white or other kinds of backgrounds in rural Oklahoma. And so actually to be country or to be rural doesn't have this one-to-one correspondence, despite how we might often think of it. And it's another way of, I'm just gushing about Oklahoma, I guess, today. I just think.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, I mean, it's so good to get some context from people that have the context. Because, like I said, I've been to Oklahoma and have family from Oklahoma. But the context was still missing, even though I had that connection, because I wasn't living in it. And just when you said that you lived in this like multicultural and multiracial family, I'm thinking, wow, I just never thought about that in Oklahoma City. That's how I, in my head, I'm still like, oh, wow. And then the idea that country doesn't equal conservative, I definitely have that one-to-one correspondence in my head.
Yeah, especially Arizona. I really think that there's a closer, it's not 100%, but there's a closer correlation. Country, well, I used to even use the word country, but like rural and conservative is pretty closely related. So unlike Oklahoma.
Yeah, well, in Oklahoma, you have places like Boley, Oklahoma, which is a largely Black town, and where they host the Boley Rodeo, which is like a famous Black rodeo or predominantly Black rodeo.
Yeah,
and it's very country and very rural. So, I mean, I think that it just sort of, you look at some of these things and you look at place and, what's categorized as rural versus urban, which most of Oklahoma is rural.
Right.
So of course, we all have these correspondences, but it's not hard to find things that defy that and that remind us that the world is more complicated than even our perceptions of it as social scientists.
Right. Always more complicated.
Yes.
Well, and it's not fair to just have the idea in our heads that cowboys are Anglo, because that's completely not true.
The first ones were not white.
Exactly.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Houston rodeo here, I got to experience that for seeing some of it for the first time since COVID and living here. And I was just like, wow, this is so refreshing because it is such a diverse makeup of the cowboy as a sort of genre. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay, so you brought up We All Country. What does that mean, and why did you title your paper that?
Yeah, so I'm really glad to get asked this because I'm a big fan of Foxy, the drag queen. She actually, this is a quote from her. She, when asked to characterize drag in Oklahoma, as all the participants were asked to do, she went on to talk about how, it's very different. You've got Black drag queens or drag performers, white drag performers, Latinx drag performers, indigenous drag performers. Oklahoma's got all this mix, but she said, well, we all country. That's sort of in a way that kind of sounds like a criticism if it's out of context, but actually it's not. It was sort of this thing that but we're all Oklahoman. We're all here. We're all going to be considered country compared to a New York City queen or a Los Angeles drag performer. So, and if you go further south, maybe they'll even get more country or more southern, but we all are here and we're all country queens. And that doesn't mean that everyone's up there doing Dolly Parton or Casey Musgraves or anything that necessarily sort of is indexical of a kind of country music or country genre, but rather I think it was kind of this way of thinking about how Oklahoma performers have to exist, in this case, in the city, Oklahoma City, in a state that's not really easy to exist in or to operate in as drag performers. And so I kind of thought of it as a cool way of reminding the reader that we think country, kind of like we were just talking about, and we think Anglo, we think conservative, working class, but actually country can mean other things. And for some of these performers, it doesn't necessarily have a racial component. And it certainly doesn't seem to have necessarily a political component, but rather it's more of a sort of general regional and perhaps even somewhat kind of lifestyle component, that life just moves slower in a place like Oklahoma City.
And is class related?
Yes, I think class related too, to some extent, mostly middle, lower class or working class. I think that's probably fair to say, but yes.
Well, it was obviously said with affection, and I really did appreciate that. I mean, of course, people often think of their identity in a positive way, but it was nice to feel like this word had been reclaimed, even though I'm not sure that's the right word for it. But it was really refreshing to read that part of your paper.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it was never meant to be anything but positive, as a sort of unifying kind of umbrella term that Foxy was using to talk about drag performers. And yeah, and I mean, that's why I chose to keep it in the title to put it in the title, because it was such a nice way of thinking about country as an inclusive term, which I think is kind of crazy,
No, but it's beautiful. I'm so glad to think You're helping me out so much. That's why I love our guests so much. It's like expands my mind every time we talk to someone. Because again, I know rationally for a fact, like I have facts that country doesn't have to equate to Anglo and to all of these things that media has set up and portrayed. It doesn't have to be that way, but it still helps to have conversations with people like you to expand my conceptualization of it.
Yeah, I feel the same way about talking to drag performers. I'm like, wow, I learn something every time I do this. Or every time I even listen to it.
What a job you have. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, when I was doing this research, when I was out doing the field work, I was like, I mean, I'm just going to drag shows and staying up late talking to drag performers afterwards, usually. It's kind of the best way to do research.
Yeah. Have you ever done any drag yourself?
I have gotten in drag a few times for Halloween and whatnot, but no, not professionally like and not with any kind of skill to brag about.
Yeah, that's another thing. This is skill. This is
absolutely.
Yeah, because like I guess like technically I've done drag for Halloween too. Like I was Psy for Halloween one year, but I didn't really conceptualize it that way. But it was.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, well, and then there's the notion that we're sort of always doing drag in one way or another. But yeah, to think about it as this sort of elaborate dressing up and embellishing some kind of aspect about the character we're doing. I mean, I kind of think that everyone should try on a wig once in a while just to see how it makes them feel and see what it does.
So itchy.
A better wig than Carrie. Get a better wig.
Yeah, a higher quality wig.
I mean, also the thing you put underneath it helps, but honestly, I think I have sensory issues because I just
yeah.
But you should still definitely try it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about the linguistic repertoire of drag performers? Because I'm thinking of, so you gave us a little impression earlier. I'm thinking about like there's the stereotypical Southern drawl. Like how is that employed in Oklahoma City?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that Oklahomans have a lot of the same social associations that we have with Southern sound. I mean, remember that I mentioned that Oklahoma is a sort of dialectologically diverse area, but it's certainly on what a professor of mine called, Sarah Loss at Oklahoma State, called the Southern periphery, meaning that, it does have a lot of sound phonological stuff that seems to be borrowed from the South. We're participants in the pin-pen merger. Lots of Oklahomans can say what time is it instead of what time is it. But also there's a lot of Midland influence. So there's Oklahomans who can say my car needs washed. So that needs plus past participle construction. The caught merger, which I have to try really hard to distinguish caught.
Me too.
I can't do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're from like, west of Ohio, practically, you're a merger speaker. But yeah, so there's some really fun stuff there. So I think that to some extent that Oklahoman drag performers can still use the sort of Southern sounding stuff because it does, although we've got all these sort of educational or intelligent or politically oriented language attitudes, there's also that sort of Southern voices are kind and polite and very friendly. And I think there's a lot of that's played up on in drag performance. But there's so many other stylistics too. I mean, like you can hear dialects of like Chicano English, so like not even necessarily like, I mean, you absolutely can see Spanish in drag performance and sometimes in people talking on the mic in Oklahoma City, but you can get those kinds of stylistics, lots and lots of African-American language varieties used and employed by not just African-American identifying performers. So there's a lot of dialectological diversity and stylistic diversity amongst the drag performers. One of the things I asked, actually, it wasn't highlighted on in this article in particular, but one of the things I asked actually had two different questions and they were designed to target explicit versus implicit stuff. The first question is there a particular way that a drag performer talks? And almost everybody in response to this was like, oh, do you mean drag slang? And I'd be like, yeah, sure. Tell me about it. And so I got lots of lists of drag slang. And I'll tell you something very cool about that. But the second question was, what does it mean to talk like a drag queen? And essentially this was to target the archetype of the drag queen. And so I was expecting to get more implicit presuppositional stuff. And I did. It was really fun. So there's lots of these things that sort of bore out in conversations. But one of the really cool things in terms of drag slang is that we get a lot of work, slay, wig, snatched, A lot of this stuff that we see now a lot in popular culture. But one of the fascinating things is that drag performers continually told me that bitch was a slang item. And I kept thinking, like, this is so interesting because I wouldn't think of this as slang. It's just a word that we have in English. It prompted me to go back and look. And sure enough, what the paper I'm working on right now is actually that there are drag performers in Oklahoma City using bitch as a discourse marker.
Yay! Yay!
How exactly?
So the two pieces of information that have led me to this distinction is that it's not clear that anyone is being called bitch. It's just sort of like, bitch, let me tell you what happened today, bitch. You won't believe what happened. And it could be a room full of people and like, okay, well, who's the bitch? Who's getting called bitch?
Right.
And then secondly, when it seems to like end something like, okay, Foxy, for example, there's a quote, I think I can almost do verbatim, where she says, she's talking about the kinds of music that she lip syncs to. And she goes, if RuPaul's was back then, bitch, I couldn't lip sync to save my life, bitch, because a bitch don't know no country by heart, bitch. And so there's lots of bitch in there, and they're
different.
Yeah, they're not all functioning the same way, right? But the ones that where it's unclear as to if someone's, it's like, is it being used vocatively? Is someone being called bitch? Or is it helping to organize the information that comes before or after it? And if the answer is yes, then of course it's a discourse marker. So it's really fun. There's really, really fun stuff that I haven't seen documented elsewhere. But I also kind of think that this isn't new, that this is probably something that's been around in African-American women's speech or femme Black speakers, which if there's one thing to take away from my work with drag queens in Oklahoma City, it's that boy, do we have a long history of totally not acknowledging that femme and female Black speakers have given us all of the cool language that we use in drag and in pop culture. I mean, almost all of it.
I was going to ask about that. I mean, is there a sense that it's appropriative in this space? It doesn't seem like it is in the same way in different spaces.
It's so fascinating because what's really interesting is that when asking drag performers in this community how they feel about drag slang or what gets used, almost all of the younger, less experienced performers have really prescriptive attitudes about it. Like they'll say things like, oh yeah, well, you got to know how to use drag slang right. And like when someone says that, you know, all tea, no shade or no tea, no shade, and they say these things and they don't know, it's like, girl, figure it out, or you're not really gay, or, you know, you don't have the right to say this. But actually all the older performers, especially the older performers who are performers of color, tend to say, this stuff has been around for forever. And the stuff that you're hearing on RuPaul's Drag Race or on TV, that's not them coming up with it. We've been saying that. So it's more important to know where it came from than to be policing people how to use it. And it clearly shows a distinction between experience, right? Like we're talking about people who are like, hey, acknowledge me. I've been doing the same stuff you're applauding them for. Whereas the younger speakers have more to lose. They're trying to establish themselves as genuine performers, in-group members. So it's really fascinating that doesn't directly answer your question about whether it's perceived as appropriated. I think that in some cases it is, but I think a lot of this seems to be kind of like drag language, I think in some cases, depending on how it's used, is kind of thought of as cultural currency. Like if you're able to use it correctly and acknowledge that you're not the person who made it up or that it's been used for a long time, this is a way of signaling you belong to this group or you're a member of this community, rather than borrowing language and appropriating it from a particular. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yes.
And can we talk about what it means to use it correctly? Because this is a really important distinction because we're not talking prescriptively.
Yeah, well, okay, so this is really fascinating, right? Like when particularly the younger performers talk about how one should say, like, so no tea, no shade, right? This is sort of like, or all tea, no shade, for example. The no shade part is almost directly borrowed from, and you can see this in Paris is Burning in the documentary about 1980s, 1990s Harlem ball culture. This is clearly borrowed from signifying and the dozens in African-American language discourse practices, where shade is just the sort of art of ritual insult, making fun of each other. Lots of more experienced drag performers talk about needing thick skin or being able to take jokes and throw them back. It's just a part of community bonding. And in fact, it's a way of showing that you respect somebody or like them if you can poke fun at them. And so when someone says no shade, that means like, I'm going to tell you something that's, you know, I'm not just trying to hurt your feelings. I'm letting you know something to let you know. And if they say all tea, it's I'm trying to tell you the truth. I'm trying to give you the business. So these are the sort of, I mean, honestly, well, we're linguists, so of course we would expect this, but context really makes the difference between using it correctly or not. And I think that you can see some variation in how it gets used. But I also think that probably the more experienced you are, the more you can sort of flounder some of these rules. And the less experienced you are, the more you see them as concrete. And perhaps the more inexperienced you are, and maybe the more, I want to say, white you are. I mean, so like one of the groups, the kinship systems I looked at here involves Foxy, who is an African-American drag queen, and her daughter, who is a white drag queen. And so her daughter did not, I mean, Foxy had made comments in some of the interviews that some of the stuff she grew up hearing from her aunts or her uncles or people that she was around, it wasn't necessarily strictly drag. But for her daughter, the drag community is where she heard this language. It's where she learned about it and where she started to use it. So in that way, we do see a kind of appropriation, but in a way that has, a sort of positive impact on family bonding. It shows a sort of mentorship or connection to drag mother, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It totally does. Yeah. And if anyone has not seen Paris is Burning, I do recommend it. I learned so much from that documentary, for sure.
Absolutely.
To go back to your bitch as a discourse marker, as soon as you gave the example, I was like, oh yeah, I've heard that many times. That is a discourse marker. I never really thought about it. So I think it is quite old, because if I've heard it, it's probably old.
Well, that's sort of what I was thinking too. And actually, in putting this sort of paper together, it sort of made me think Scott Kiesling did all that work with Dude. And we've seen other,
exactly.
Dude and Bro, and we've seen how that's sort of lost a lot of its gendered connotations. Like, I think my sisters say dude and bro way more than I ever did, although that might be a gay thing or a queer thing. I just sort of was like, ugh, I'm not going to say dude.
Yeah, I say dude a lot.
And a regional thing too, maybe. Well,
yes,
if your sisters use it more,
sure.
But yeah, regional.
Sure.
Over here on the West Coast, it's like dude.
Dude.
Yeah.
I think that has to have a like slightly fronted ooh-val. You can't just be like dude. It's got to be like dude.
It has to be. Yeah. In my head, Kara, are you not feeling that?
Well, I'm just wondering because I'm not Californian and I'm Canadian. I'm like, I don't know if I do that, but maybe I do.
Well, yeah. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, plus, the moment you start thinking that you can or don't do something and try to test yourself, I mean,
it's no longer good data.
Yeah, exactly.
The observed, yes,
exactly.
Speaking of LeBron,
exactly. The observer's paradox. Yeah, but I think that actually thinking about bitch this way sort of made me think, oh my God, wait a minute. How often, does that mean that dude and bro is also being used as a discourse marker?
It
And
is,
of course it is. And we're just sort of, I think that we've just been thinking about it as purely like what you call somebody. But actually there's, at least in the drag community, there's no gendered connotation for who gets to say bitch or who's called bitch. Regardless of gender identity or gender presentation in drag, everyone can use bitch, everyone can be called bitch, or can be in the discussion where bitch is being used. It's pretty cool.
Right, and they don't have to be part of the drag community to be, like, they could be referring to something outside of the drag community and use bitch, right? So it's not even just, like, talking about the space. It's talking about anything. Is that what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. Or that a speaker could be talking about, so it's really probably more indicative of the speaker. So not everyone is using bitch as a discourse marker, but the most evidence I have actually is from one particular drag family.
Okay.
So there seems to be a relationship there that these particular speakers are able to do so. But no, I mean, subject matter doesn't appear to be indicative of whether or not it will be used.
That's cool. Yeah. No, I'm thinking I totally have dude as a discourse marker.
Yeah, me too.
Because I say it like with my partner, but like I'm not calling him dude. Like I'll say, dude, you wouldn't believe. Like I'm not referring to him.
Right.
you know?
Right. Well, you could say, whoa, you wouldn't believe this, or oh my God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or man. Yeah. It's totally, for me, a discourse marker, mostly. Sometimes I'm actually referring to a person, but usually if I am, then it is gendered, like usually.
Yeah.
But as a discourse marker, I use it all the time. And I think I try with certain people not to, because I think I might offend them, but it's just so part of my vocabulary.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's every time I talk to students about it, they're all like, oh, yeah, dude. Yep, I use dude all the time.
Yeah.
What's really fun is I compared bitch in my data to girl. And girl gets used the same way. But I think that we have more like racialized stereotypes of who uses girl or girlfriend.
100%.
Yeah.
So it both complicates it, but also sheds light onto how this is not an entirely new phenomenon, but that this is maybe perhaps a word we just haven't paid attention to yet.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. I'm so excited about that. What an exciting paper. That's the one you're working on right now, is bitch as a discourse marker. Oh, you're going to blow it wide open. Oh, it's so exciting. So I'm thinking about intersectionally and going back to the linguistic repertoire. So I'm guessing there are Chicane performers and then African American performers. Is there like a different rate of usage of like a Southern drawl, like if the stereotypical or any sort, that could be anything. So that's just one example. Are there different rates of usage of ways of speaking or stylistic variation?
That's such a good question. I didn't necessarily look at the sort of like phonological makeup or even stylistic tendencies of each individual speaker so much as I was looking at the sort of kinds of patterns of responses based on the questions that were offered them. But I think that it depends, right? So if we're talking about, like, for example, all of the African American performers in the study were from Oklahoma and so had been raised there. Not all of the Chicane performers were from Oklahoma. So there were some from Puerto Rico. There were some from Texas and a couple performers I talked to who were originally from Mexico, but who, lived in Oklahoma. And so their particular dialect or styles were, of course, influenced by what patterns of speech they had prior to being in Oklahoma. But I can say that things like y'all, hun, or honey, and certainly the items of drag slang are all incorporated by all drag performers in Oklahoma. Like, regardless of whether, like one queen in particular who I'm thinking of, she is from Puerto Rico, but she moved to New York and was living in Bushwick for a long time and then moved to Oklahoma. So she spent most of her life not in Oklahoma, but she is a readily able y'all user and uses y'all and honey and will use some of these sort of Southern lexical items that probably are indexical of social camaraderie in this particular area, despite not having grown up with that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. I am thinking about y'all. Is sweetie, like these kind of just like endearments, is that what they're called? But like hun, like what do you think their usage is getting at? Like, why do you think there's this usage of these endearments?
Well, I think it totally depends on context, right? So like if a character or if a drag performer is doing a character or persona that's trying to play on this sort of Southern hospitality, kindly, older, Oklahoman, usually it's because some kind of perceptually drastically different voice is about to come up to create a contrast and a joke. But also, bless your heart is a real classic Oklahoma insult. This is a way of telling someone they're being dumb.
Yeah.
Oh, bless your heart.
Right.
So in context, calling some, like, oh, honey, that term of endearment can actually mean something not so endearing depending on how it's used. So I think it depends on the context. And there's so much back and forth between a drag performer and the audience whenever they're talking or they have the mic or even when they're just in conversation that I would be wary of predicting even a trend there, if that makes sense.
Also, I do that myself. I say, oh, honey.
Yeah, exactly. Me too.
You do that.
Oh, yeah. That part is not a Southern. The maybe hun would be, or y'all.
But
I'm
thinking about sweetie or anything. I'm just thinking of like
Well, sweetie, I think is maybe not Southern, but like, Florida, for example, apparently like waiters and waitresses will call you sweetie, and like that is not a thing here. For example, like you would not. So I do think like the way you use these terms, but I don't think I would say hun. Right.
Well, there's also, I think there's a phonetic possibility here too. Like again, with some vowel fronting, so that's sort of like honey.
I couldn't do that.
Yeah, like that might carry a little bit more social weight, or social meaning, a weight of social meaning in it, depending on where it gets used too. That might feel decidedly more Southern than just honey.
Yes.
Right.
What other vocabulary did you find this community and why was it interesting to you?
Let's see. Actually, I have a list up here. Sorry, I should have all this memorized, but...
No, it's okay.
So other items. Well, I can tell you that there are some things like work, which is great, and slay. These are... okay. No, I'll tell you a really fun one that because people know about work and slay. Boots. Boots is apparently an intensifier.
Oh,
and
what?
So, yes.
Example, please.
Okay, so if someone is like dressed really nicely and they're fabulous, you can say, oh my gosh, glam boots, really glamorous, really glam. Or another, it's like a phrasal intensifier is house down or the house down. So like, oh my gosh, she is like decked out the house down, and you can combine them. So I have heard like, okay, she is slaying the house down boots. So it's just added on intensifiers. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy. It's cool.
I
love it so much.
Never heard this at all.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who listens to this who has spent time in drag communities will probably have heard at least one of them, because I don't think that they're unique to Oklahoma. But I mean, the drag community uses them a lot. I mean, boots is one that got mentioned a lot on the sort of survey of drag slang, but it occurred a lot with the house down. So the house down boots is like a really intensifying whatever comes before it, whatever kind of qualitative thing that's there.
How did it make that transition? I'm so curious.
The house down, like burn the house down?
No, not that part. The boots.
Oh, the boots. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the etymology or the history of that, but I'll look into it.
Oh, yeah. Please do.
Yeah.
Report back.
I mean, I'm just, for some reason, imagining that, like, having the right shoes is important. Like, does it go back to just, like, when you have a good look, is the shoes pulling them together? I don't know. I'm just like, that's what the boots are referring to, right? Like shoes. Boots.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, at least like when respondents spelled it out for me, it was BOOTS. So, I mean, I assume, but I also, I mean, as someone who studied under Dennis Preston, I can hear him in my head telling me, be wary of folk etymologies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. For sure.
No, it's true. That's what I was doing. But I really want to know. It's very interesting. But like the house down is from burn the house down, right? Or
I'm sure.
Or bring the house down or whatever.
Yeah, I'm sure that it comes from something like that. Like, so it's just shortened. This is so X brings the house down or the house down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you brought up the kinship system, and like this is something that comes up in Paris is Burning as well. But can you describe the kinship system and why it's important to drag?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there are far more qualified people than me who have just studied queer kinship systems and why it's important in given communities. But I'll give two major reasons that showed up in the data that I had, which is the first is that it's a mentor system. It usually looks like familial sort of relationships. Like there's usually some kind of drag parent, drag mother or drag father or drag parent if they're a non-binary drag performer. And typically there's a sort of one-to-one relationship with a drag child. And that usually involves teaching how to put on makeup, teaching how to get costumes together. And for more successful drag parents, usually a little bit of a helping hand in getting them booked and getting them a spot, in a show, whether that be a sort of newcomer show or a sort of really like low entry level, in the park show, or to some extent, perhaps even being an amateur on like a well-established stage that, the drag parent can make all the difference in that. But in a place like Oklahoma, where coming out as queer or coming out as trans or coming out as non-binary, all of these things for lots of people can mean the loss of biological family or can mean strained relationships. I have more than a handful of times heard of how queer kinship systems became the thing that stopped a person from being homeless or stopped them from having nobody, that it became, it went from being a sort of community of practice to being an actual family, like chosen family. And so I am sure that Oklahoma is not, alone in this. Again, Carrie mentioned that this is in Paris is Burning. You see that that's a major part of what drag mothers do in that particular documentary. And I have in interviews in some of my work in Oklahoma, people talking explicitly about this. So queer kinship systems, particularly when it comes to drag, usually involve siblings who are about the same level of experience if they start. But you can have a drag sister or drag cousin or drag auntie. There's a lot of play family in drag, again, almost certainly borrowed from African-American culture. So that you have people who might either be in the same drag family and have the same house name, which is usually treated like a last name. So if I was a part of, Page is a really big drag family across the U.S. It's not just in Oklahoma, but Texas, Oklahoma. There are some Pages out east, but also in California. If I were a part of the Page family, I might have a really close friend who I call my auntie because she's also a Page, even though she might not ever have been my mentor, but I know that she's like siblings with my drag mom or friends with my drag mom. And so a lot of it is about connections and communities within communities. And it can play a vital role in navigating what is very often a difficult place to thrive in or survive in for queer people in Oklahoma. But it also is a way of learning about the art of drag. And I mean, in a capitalist sense, also a crucial part of networking and getting gigs.
Right. And then it's also a vital part, it seems, in your use of drag slang.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's doing all of this stuff socially or culturally, then naturally, of course, we can see some sociolinguistic patterns that are reflective of the goings on of society and culture within these groups. Absolutely. Yeah. So bitch as a discourse marker is just one of these that seems to be bearing out in the data.
Yeah, that is.
So is there anything that we should have asked you that we didn't think to ask because we're just not part of this community at all?
Well, I think one thing that probably is not maybe even new to y'all or to people listening, but drag is a really wonderful kind of art and a kind of expression. And I think that one of the things that's really great about it is that like nothing's off the table to be made fun of. You know, irreverence is everything, and poking fun at everything is how we actually take what feels like long held realities and realize that a lot of the world around us is just make-believe, and that we can do make-believe all we want. And if someone says that this is natural or this is what is supposed to be or how we ought to be behaving, drag helps us to see that, oh, actually, no, that's just your version of make-believe, and I can play my own version of make-believe, regardless of what gender I was assigned at birth, regardless of what gender I identify as, regardless of where I'm from or my relationship to the place that I'm in. Drag is a really beautiful way of saying we're kind of always playing make-believe, and we get to make meaning out of what we care about, and we get to put our values and what factors into how we decide to live our lives. We get to decide that. And I think drag is just a really, really cool way that we get to see that play out. And language is one of the crucial ways that we can actually study it and measure that.
Oh, that's great.
That's a beautiful way to end this. I mean, not that I want to, but
no, this is fun.
We have to eventually, right? So.
Right.
Yeah, that was really great.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you guys. Those were such great questions. And that was a really fun conversation to have.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for educating us.
Yes.
Oh, ditto.
And we always leave our listeners with one final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Thank you again so much.
Of course. Thank y'all.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.